The stars had never belonged to humanity for 300 years. The children of Earth lived under the shadow of their masters, and they learned to bow their heads and speak only when spoken to. And they forgot what it meant to be free. Dominion of the 12 thrones had come to Earth in the year 2187, when humanity was still young and full of hope, when the first fusion ships were just beginning to carry brave explorers beyond the asteroid belt, when scientists dreamed of touching distant suns and poets wrote songs about the endless possibilities waiting in the dark between worlds. 12 had watched humanity from afar for many decades, and what they saw terrified them. They saw a species that had gone from riding horses to splitting atoms in less than 2 centuries. And they saw people who refused to accept limits, who looked at impossible problems and found ways to solve them anyway, who burned with an ambition that the ancient races had lost long ago. The elder species of the Dominion had taken thousands of years to develop the technologies that humans were creating in mere generations. And they understood what this meant, and they knew that if humanity was allowed to grow unchecked, these strange creatures from the small blue world would one day challenge the order of the galaxy itself. So, they came to Earth not as friends, but as conquerors. The war, if it could be called that, lasted only 6 days, and humanity fought with everything they had, with nuclear fire and desperate courage. But their weapons were nothing against the shields and gravity beams of the Dominion fleet, and when the smoke cleared, 12 billion humans looked up at the sky and saw only chains. Treaty of Submission was signed in the ruins of what had once been called Geneva, and the terms were absolute, and there was no negotiation. Only obedience. Humanity was forbidden from building weapons beyond a certain class, and their population was capped at a number the Dominion considered safe, and their colonies were limited to 3 barren moons where nothing green could grow without machines. And their scientists were watched by alien overseers who made sure no dangerous ideas took root. And their soldiers were taken from their families and sent to die in wars that had nothing to do with Earth. The humans who fought in these foreign wars were considered expendable, too crude and primitive for anything except absorbing enemy fire. And they were given the worst equipment and sent to the most dangerous fronts. And when they died, their names were not recorded, and their bodies were not returned. Admiral Yuki Tanaka remembered all of this as she stood on the bridge of the patrol vessel where she served, watching another transport ship carry young human soldiers toward a battle. They would not survive. She was 63 years old, and her black hair had turned gray at the temples, and her eyes held the weight of decades spent watching her people suffer. And she had learned long ago to hide her true feelings behind a mask of perfect obedience. The Valith overseer on her bridge, a tall creature with pale blue skin and eyes like chips of ice, did not even look at the transport as it passed to him. The humans aboard were less than animals, useful only for their willingness to die. Tanaka said nothing, but her hands tightened on the railing until her knuckles turned white. She had been born into chains, and she had spent her entire life pretending to accept them. And every day she smiled at her masters and followed their orders and acted like the obedient servant they expected her to be. But deep inside her heart, a fire burned that had never gone out. She was not alone across the scattered remnants of human civilization. In hidden corners and secret networks, others like her had been gathering for generations. And they called themselves the Unchained, and they remembered what humanity had once been. And they dreamed of what humanity could become again. The Dominion believed they had broken humanity's spirit, but they had only driven it underground in asteroid bases hidden in the deepest reaches of the solar system. Human scientists worked on technologies that their masters had forbidden, and they passed their research from generation to generation in coded messages and encrypted files. And they built things in the darkness that would have made the 12 tremble with fear. In the military academies where young humans were trained to serve as cannon fodder, Instructors loyal to the Unchained taught their students more than obedience, and they taught them tactics and strategies that had nothing to do with dying for alien masters. And they planted seeds of rebellion that grew slowly and silently in willing hearts, the diplomatic halls where human servants poured drinks and cleaned floors. Sharp eyes watched and sharp ears listened, and every secret the Dominion thought was safe was recorded and transmitted to those who knew how to use. If 300 years of patient preparation had created something the 12 could not imagine, Tanaka received a message that night through channels so secure that no Dominion technology could detect them. And the message was short and simple, and it made her heart pound in her chest. Project Prometheus is complete, it said. The fleet awaits your command. She stood alone in her quarters and looked out at the stars that humanity had been forbidden to touch. And she thought about all the generations who had lived and died in chains, never knowing freedom, never having a chance to reach for their dreams. And she thought about her own parents, who had been executed when she was a child for the crime of teaching her to read forbidden books. And she remembered her mother's last words to her as the Dominion soldiers dragged them away. Remember who you are, her mother had whispered. Remember what we can be. Tanaka closed her eyes and made a silent promise to the ghosts of everyone who had suffered under the Dominion's rule. Soon, she thought, soon the chains will break, and the galaxy will learn what it means to make enemies of humanity. The hour of reckoning was coming, and nothing in the universe would be able to stop it. The breaking point came on a cold morning in a place called Harvest Colony 7. It was a small world at the edge of human space. A moon covered in carefully tended fields where 30,000 colonists worked day and night to grow grain for their Dominion masters. And they had built something beautiful in the harsh soil, something green and golden that fed millions across a dozen star systems. The colonists had lived there for 5 generations, and they had made the barren rock into a home. And their children played in the fields under an artificial sun. And they told themselves that if they worked hard enough and obeyed well enough, maybe someday their lives would get better. They were wrong. The Valith overlord named Kethvon arrived without warning on a ship as black as death itself. And he did not come to praise the colonists for their hard work. And he did not come to thank them for feeding his people. He came to take everything the Dominion was fighting, a war on the far side of the galaxy. A war that had nothing to do with humanity, and they needed supplies. And they did not care where those supplies came from. Kethvon stood in the center of the colony's main square and announced that the entire harvest would be taken, every grain of wheat and every kernel of corn, and nothing would be left for the humans who had grown it. Colony Director Marcus Webb stepped forward with shaking hands and tried to explain that this would mean starvation for his people, that there were children here who would die without food, that surely there could be some other way. Thon looked down at the small human with eyes that held no mercy and no understanding, and he saw only an insect daring to question its betters. You exist to serve, the Overlord said. Your lives have no value beyond your usefulness to the Dominion. Marcus Webb was a gentleman who had never raised his voice in anger, a man who had spent his whole life trying to keep his people safe by following every rule and accepting every burden. But something changed in him at that moment, and he found courage he did not know he had. We are not your slaves, he said, and his voice carried across the square. We are human beings, and we deserve to live. Kethvon's response was swift and brutal. He drew his plasma blade and cut Marcus Webb down in front of his people. And the colony director fell to the ground with his blood staining the earth he had worked so hard to make bloom. And his last breath was a whisper that no one could hear, but someone was watching. Ensign Sarah Webb served on a Dominion patrol vessel 3 star systems away, and she had been forced to watch the execution on a live broadcast meant to remind all humans of their place. And she saw her father die with his eyes still full of defiance. She was 24 years old, and she had joined the Dominion fleet because there was no other choice. And she had told herself that she was protecting her family by serving their masters faithfully. Now her father was dead, and her family was starving, and all her obedience had meant nothing. The other crew members on the bridge glanced at her nervously, waiting to see what she would do, and the Valith officers barely noticed her at all, because she was just another human. Just another piece of equipment that could be replaced. Sarah stood very still for a long moment, and tears ran down her face. But her eyes were not filled with grief. They were filled with fire. She walked to the communications console with calm and measured steps. And before anyone could stop her, she entered a code that the Unchained had given her years ago. A code she had never thought she would use. The broadcast went out on every frequency, to every ship and station and colony where humans could hear it. And her voice was steady, even as her heart was breaking. "My name is Sarah Webb," she said. "You just watched the Dominion murder my father for asking his people not to starve. And I am done pretending that this is acceptable. And I am done bowing to creatures who see us as nothing more than tools." She paused and took a breath that felt like the first real breath of her life. To every human listening, the time has come to remember who we are. And we are not slaves, and we are not cattle, and we are not the broken species they tried to make us. We are humanity, and we are no longer holding back across the galaxy. The Unchained heard her words and knew that the moment they had prepared for had finally arrived. Admiral Tanaka received the signal on her hidden communicator, and she smiled for the first time in years. And she sent the order that would change everything. "Activate Project Prometheus," she commanded. "All ships, all stations, all personnel. The revolution begins now." In the Oort cloud at the edge of the solar system, massive doors opened in asteroids that the Dominion had never thought to scan, and ships emerged from the darkness like wolves awakening from a long sleep. Ships that had been built in secret over 300 years. Ships that carried weapons the Dominion could not imagine on 100 worlds. Human soldiers who had been forced to fight for their masters suddenly turned their weapons in new directions. And Dominion officers who had never seen humans as a threat found themselves facing enemies they had created with their own cruelty. Valith on Sarah's ship tried to stop her, but he was too slow. And the other humans on the bridge had been waiting for this moment just as long as she had. And when it was over, the patrol vessel belonged to humanity. Sarah took the captain's chair and looked out at the stars that had been forbidden to her people for so long. "All ships," she broadcast on the Unchained frequency, "form up on my position, and let's go free our people." The revolution had begun, and there would be no going back. And the Dominion would learn the price of underestimating humanity. The chains were breaking, and the sound they made was louder than thunder. The Dominion had protocols for dealing with rebellions. They had crushed uprisings before, hundreds of them across 40,000 years of rule. And they knew exactly how to break the spirit of species that dared to challenge their authority. First came overwhelming force. Fleets of warships that darkened the skies of rebel worlds, and then came the executions, public displays of power that reminded everyone of the cost of defiance. And finally came the collective punishment. Entire populations starved or displaced until the survivors learned to fear even the thought of resistance. The 12 Thrones expected the human rebellion to follow the same pattern as all the others. A brief flare of violence followed by swift defeat and generations of harsher subjugation. They were catastrophically wrong. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Inns, Prometheus, and watched her fleet emerge from the darkness of the outer solar system like ghosts given form. And she allowed herself a moment of pure satisfaction. The Prometheus was humanity's first true warship, Not the converted transports and patrol vessels the Dominion allowed them to operate, but a ship built from the ground up for one purpose only: war. Its hull was sleek and dark, covered in armor that could absorb energy weapons and deflect kinetic rounds, and its engines burned with a blue fire that no Dominion scientist could explain, and its weapons bays held technologies that humanity had developed in secret, while their masters thought they were too primitive to be a threat. Main weapon was called the Helios Lance, and it could generate a beam of focused plasma hot enough to crack a planet's crust. And the Dominion had banned such weapons millennia ago because they considered them uncivilized. Humanity no longer cared about being civilized. Fleet that followed the Prometheus numbered 300 ships, each one a miracle of hidden engineering and desperate innovation. And every crew member had trained for this moment their entire lives. And they were ready. The first real battle happened at a place called the Nexus of Keth, a massive space station where the Dominion conducted trade and displayed their power to the lesser species of the Galaxy. 12 Valith warships guarded the station, each one crewed by officers who had never lost a battle, who had never faced an enemy they could not crush with ease, who looked at the 3 human vessels approaching them and laughed at the absurdity of it. The Valith commander broadcast a message telling the humans to surrender immediately, promising that their deaths would be quick if they complied. Captain Sarah Webb commanded the lead ship, a cruiser called the Defiance, and she responded to the Valith commander with a smile on her face. "We're done surrendering," she said. "You can join your overlord in whatever hell awaits creatures like you." The battle lasted 11 minutes. The Dominion ships fired first, confident in their superior technology and their ancient experience, and their weapons splashed harmlessly against shields that absorbed and redirected energy in ways they had never seen before. Then the human ships fired back. The Valith had never encountered weapons like these: beams that cut through their armor like paper, missiles that seemed to think for themselves and found weaknesses in their defenses, railgun rounds accelerated to fractions of light speed that punched holes through their strongest hulls. When the battle ended, the Valith fleet was nothing but expanding clouds of debris, and the 3 human ships were damaged but still flying. And the crew of the Defiance cheered so loud that Sarah had to cover her ears. But she did not celebrate for long, because she knew this was only the beginning. Across the galaxy, word of the battle spread faster than anyone expected, carried by traders and refugees and spies who had been waiting for exactly this kind of news. The Dominion had been defeated not by another elder species, not by some ancient power that had slumbered for millennia, but by the humans, the primitive creatures who were supposed to be nothing more than servants and soldiers and slaves. Other, oppressed species began to stir. The Kethmari had been conquered by the Dominion long before humanity even existed, and they had served as laborers and craftsmen for so many generations that most of them had forgotten what freedom felt like. But some of them still remembered the old stories, and some of them still dreamed of breaking free. Their leader was an old warrior named Vastan, scarred from decades of punishment for small acts of defiance, and he had watched the humans with careful eyes ever since they first arrived in the galaxy, and he had seen something in them that gave him hope. When news of the human victory reached him, he gathered his most trusted followers and sent a message to Admiral Tanaka. "We wish to fight alongside you." The message said, "Tell us how we can help." Tanaka met with Voston on a neutral station, and the old Kethmari knelt before her in the traditional gesture of submission that his people had been taught to show. Their master, she reached down and lifted him gently to his feet. "No one kneels anymore," she said. "Stand with us as equals, and we will burn the thrones together." Voston looked at this small human woman who had somehow brought the mighty Dominion to its knees, and for the first time in his long life, he felt tears running down his face. "You give us our dignity back," he said. "We will never forget this." The Kethmari were the first to join the rebellion. But they were not the last. Within months, 17 species had risen against their masters. And ships from worlds that had never worked together before now flew in formation against the common enemy. And the rebellion became something the Dominion had not faced in 40,000 years. It became a revolution, and at its heart were the humans. The species that had been chained and broken and underestimated. Now leading the greatest uprising the galaxy had ever seen, the wolves had been unleashed, and they were hungry for justice. The 12 thrones convened for the first time in 6,000 years. Great chamber where they met was older than most civilizations. A vast hall of crystal and gold, where the rulers of the galaxy had once gathered to divide up the stars. And the walls were covered with images of their countless victories, their conquered worlds, their broken enemies. Now the rulers sat in their ancient seats and felt something they had not felt in millennia fear. Archon of the Valith spoke first, his voice echoing through the chamber like the hiss of a dying fire. "How is this possible?" he demanded. "They were primitives, barely able to leave their own planet when we found them. And now they destroy our fleets and turn our subjects against us." The other rulers had no answers. Only excuses and accusations and blame that went nowhere. Truth was something none of them wanted to accept for 300 years. Humanity had been watching. Every war the Dominion forced humans to fight. Every ship they forced humans to crew. Every diplomatic meeting where human servants stood quietly in corners and poured drinks for their masters. Everything had been observed and recorded and analyzed. Human soldiers dying on alien battlefields had studied the tactics of their enemies and found the weaknesses hidden in their strategies. Human technicians maintaining Dominion equipment had mapped every system and noted every flaw and every vulnerability. Human servants in the halls of power had listened to secrets that their masters spoke freely in front of them because they believed humans were too stupid to understand. 3 centuries of patient intelligence gathering had given humanity a complete picture of how the Dominion worked, what it feared, where it was strong, and where it could be broken, and humanity had used every bit of that knowledge to prepare for this moment. Archon called for his admirals to crush the rebellion with the full force of the Dominion Navy. But the admirals reported losses that seemed impossible. Fleets destroyed by enemies who seemed to know exactly where they would be and what they would do. The humans did not fight like a proper species. They did not arrange formal battles or follow the ancient protocols of war that the Dominion had used. For 40,000 years they struck from nowhere and vanished before anyone could respond, targeting supply lines and communication relays and command vessels, leaving chaos in their wake. They used tactics that seemed insane until they worked, sending small ships to draw enemy fire while larger vessels struck from unexpected angles, using asteroids and debris fields as cover, fighting in ways that no respectable species would consider, and worst of all, they fought with a fury that the long-lived elder species simply could not match. Humans lived short lives compared to the rulers of the Dominion, and perhaps that was why they burned so brightly, why they threw themselves into battle with a passion that terrified creatures who had grown comfortable with their immortality. The war raged for years across 1,000 star systems. Admiral Tanaka led the assault on Throne Prime itself, the ancient world at the heart of Dominion power, where the 12 had ruled unchallenged since before humans had learned to make fire. The battle in orbit was the largest the galaxy had ever seen. Thousands of ships from both sides filling the sky with fire and death. And the losses on both sides were staggering. But humanity had something the Dominion did not. They had allies who believed in them. Kethmari cruisers fought alongside human destroyers, their crews working together in ways that would have been unthinkable just a few years before. Ships from the Vorn Collective and the Tessic Empire, and a dozen other freed species added their strength to the attack. And for the first time in history, the oppressed peoples of the galaxy stood united against their oppressors. Captain Sarah Webb led the ground assault, commanding troops that had been enhanced with technologies that merged biology and machine. Soldiers who were faster and stronger and harder to kill than anything the Dominion had faced before. They fought through the ancient streets of the capital city, past monuments to Dominion glory and statues of archons who had ruled for millennia. And they left nothing standing behind them. Sarah's strike team breached the palace where the Archon of the Valeth had taken refuge, cutting through his guards with plasma rifles and vibroblades. And when they reached the throne room, they found him waiting for them. He was ancient beyond measure. His pale blue skin stretched thin over bones that had carried the weight of power for longer than humanity had existed. And he wore ceremonial armor that had never seen real battle. And he looked at these small creatures who had dared to challenge him with contempt in his eyes. "You cannot win," he said. "We are eternal, and we are the order of the galaxy. And when this foolishness is over, we will make your people suffer for 1,000 generations." Sarah stepped forward and removed her helmet so he could see her face. "Do you remember Harvest Colony 7? She asked. "Do you remember the man your kind murdered for asking not to let his people starve?" The Archon did not answer because he did not remember. Because to him, the death of one human had meant nothing at all. "His name was Marcus Webb," Sarah said. "He was my father, and he died believing that we could be more than slaves. And I'm here to prove him right." She raised her weapon. "The Dominion is over," she said. "The thrones are finished. And you are the last Archon who will ever sit in that chair." When the shot echoed through the ancient hall, 40,000 years of tyranny came to an end. The Archon fell, and the palace fell, and one by one, the other thrones fell as well. The war was not over yet, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Humanity had won. The war lasted 7 years from the first shot to the last surrender. It cost humanity more than they could ever fully count. Billions of lives lost on battlefields across 1,000 worlds, colonies reduced to ash, families torn apart by violence that seemed like it would never end. But when the guns finally fell silent and the smoke cleared from the skies of 100 planets, humanity stood among the stars, not as slaves, but as liberators. The dominion of the 12 thrones was dismantled piece by piece, its laws abolished, its institutions dissolved, its power scattered to the winds of history. The surviving elder species were given a choice by the victors. They could adapt to a new galactic order built on equality and mutual respect, where no species ruled over another, and every people had the right to determine their own destiny, or they could fade into irrelevance, clinging to their old ways in a universe that had moved beyond them. Most chose adaptation, because even ancient creatures could learn new truths when the alternative was extinction. The old ways were dead, and nothing would bring them back 5 years after the war ended. Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood before the newly formed Galactic Assembly and prepared to give the most important speech of her life. She was 75 years old now, her hair completely gray, and her face marked by scars that told stories of battles she had fought and friends she had lost. But her eyes were still sharp, and her voice was still strong. And when she spoke, every being in the vast chamber listened. The hall was filled with representatives from over 200 species, creatures of every shape and size and color. Beings who had been slaves for longer than humanity had existed as a species. Beings who had never known freedom until humans showed them it was possible. "We did not seek this war," Tanaka said, and her words carried across the assembly like a song that everyone needed to hear. "We sought only to live, to grow, to reach for the stars with our own hands and build a future for our children. You put chains on that dream, she continued, looking at the elder species representatives who sat in the back of the hall. You made us kneel until we forgot how to stand. And you told us that we were nothing, that our lives had no value, that we existed only to serve your purposes. She paused and took a breath that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. But humanity has a flaw, she said, and a small smile crossed her face. We do not stay broken, and we do not accept limits. And we do not forget those who showed us cruelty. Her expression softened as she looked out at the assembled representatives. We also do not forget those who showed us kindness, she said. We remember the species who hid our scientists when the Dominion was hunting them. And we remember the rebels who shared our prison cells and whispered words of encouragement when we wanted to give up. And we remember the voices that told us to have courage when all hope seemed lost. This new order is not about human dominance, she declared, and her voice rang with conviction. We did not break our chains just to put them on someone else, and we did not fight for freedom just to become the tyrants we overthrew. This new order is about what we learned in the darkness, that freedom must be held together or it falls apart, that no species can truly be free while others are enslaved, that the only way forward is together. The assembly rose to their feet and applauded, a sound like thunder rolling across the chamber. And Tanaka bowed her head in acknowledgement. Before stepping down from the podium, she had done her part. And now it was time for others to carry the work forward. Captain Sarah Webb stood at a viewport on the orbital station above Earth, watching the endless dance of ships from 100 different species passing by. Transports and cruisers and explorers all going about the business of a galaxy that had been reborn. She was 36 years old now, no longer the angry young ensign who had watched her father die, and the years had given her wisdom and perspective that her younger self could not have imagined. Human children played in the station's gardens alongside young from a dozen different species, their laughter echoing through the corridors. And no one seemed to notice or care that they were different from each other. They were just children, playing together under an artificial sun, dreaming about futures that had no limits. An old Kethmari veteran approached Sarah, walking slowly with the aid of a cane. His scales faded with age, but his eyes still bright with intelligence. His name was Talvos, and he was the son of Vostan, the first Kethmari leader to join the rebellion, who had died in the final battle for Throne Prime. Do you think it will last? Talas asked, looking out at the ships and the stars beyond them. This peace we have built, do you think it will survive? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. She thought about all the wars that had come before, all the empires that had risen and fallen, all the promises of peace that had been broken by greed and fear and misunderstanding. I do not know, she admitted, because she had learned that honesty was more valuable than false hope. The galaxy is vast, and there are many who still believe in the old ways, and peace is harder to maintain than war. She turned to look at the old Kethmari, and her eyes held the same fire that had burned in them on the day she declared rebellion. But I know this, she said. We will fight for it, every day and every hour, for as long as we live, and for all the generations that come after us, because that is what we do. She smiled, watching a human pilot guide a freighter alongside a Kethmari cruiser, their crews waving to each other through the viewports like old friends. We hold on, she said. No matter what, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how many times we stumble and fall, we get back up and we keep going. That is what it means to be human. Talalos nodded slowly, understanding in his ancient eyes. Perhaps that is why you won, he said. Not because you were stronger or smarter than the Dominion, but because you refused to give up, even when giving up would have been easier. Sarah looked out at the stars that had once been cages and chains, stars that now burned with the light of infinite possibility. We are stubborn, she agreed. It is our greatest flaw and our greatest strength. The old Kethmari laughed, a sound like stones clicking together. And for a moment, they stood in comfortable silence. Two warriors from different worlds, sharing a moment of peace that their ancestors could never have imagined. Thrones were ash, the chains were broken, and humanity, unchained at last, walked among the cosmos not as conquerors, but as what they had always been meant to be: free.